Okay, in the last video I said we were going to look at this letter that I have that belonged to Charles Milles Manson Jr. That's a spot on the front of it. It was mailed by the United States Department of Justice. It looks like down here. And from Washington, D.C. And Charles Milles Manson. And this is Charles Milles Manson Jr. right there. You notice I noticed about a lot of his pictures. He's always got the expression on his face like it was taken by the FBI, like they were the photographer, because he's looking like shocked. So in the last video we were talking about how Rosalie Willis met Charles Manson. And now they were on a trip across the United States, headed to Los Angeles to live with Manson's mother. If you didn't see that, go back and watch that. Now we're in Los Angeles and we're going to continue the story from there. We're going to find out why the FBI sent Jay a letter, and a little bit more about Jay, and a little bit more about Jay's son. This wasn't the first time that Charles Manson tried to make it to Los Angeles in a stolen car. The first time was in Boy's home. He stole a car with him and his buddy. They started driving across the upper part of the United States, headed for Los Angeles. They didn't make it. They got arrested in Oregon. Manson spent time there until they sent him back with his mom again in Indiana. Now, him and Rosie, they don't have a whole lot of money. She's going on her last paychecks from the hospital where she worked in the cafeteria, and Charles Manson worked at the racetrack, so they're taking off on their last paychecks from there. But Charlie said by the time that they made it to Los Angeles, he had a straw hat in the back seat that was full of about $500 worth of dimes. So they weren't really struggling with money. They were staying in motels. They were doing the things that tourists do, all the way to Los Angeles in a stolen car on their last paychecks with a straw hat full of stolen dimes. Charlie's telling me these stories, and I'm sitting there just mesmerized. And I barely say anything, but sometimes I'll ask questions. I'm like, where did the dimes come from? How'd you steal a bunch of dimes? And you know, you've seen Manson's conversations. He says something like this: Franklin D. Roosevelt gave me those dimes. And rather than me be Geraldo and say, come on, man, Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't give you those dimes, I just went along. I was like, really? How did that happen? So then he gets into the explanation of how when Franklin D. Roosevelt came into office, he had polio, so he started a program in the White House called the March of Dimes. The program, by the time the 1950s were around, it was failing. You know, it wasn't making a whole lot of money. When it first started out, it made a ton of money. People were sending dimes to the White House, and the White House couldn't keep up with the dimes that they were sending them. But now the program was failing, and so the mothers of children who had polio, they came out with another drive of this March of Dimes thing, and now they were putting their kids on cans with in braces, with crutches and things like that, and they were setting them in every single store. They were setting them in gas stations, in motels, in restaurants. Everywhere that you went, you could see one of these little March of Dimes canisters, and you would put your dimes in them. And Charlie, he was siphoning off his share off of every single can down Route 66. And he said down Route 66, every place you would go had a March of Dimes container. So he takes the containers, dump the dimes into the straw hat, and get rid of the evidence out the window on the way down Route 66. So he had a gun. He said he had a gun, but he didn't use it. He was just stealing March of Dimes containers all the way down, right across America. So I'm sitting there listening, I mean, again, in amazement, because this, come on, we're like at the same table. This is the hippie cult leader. I mean, he's telling me a story that sounds like the redneck Bonnie and Clyde. I almost feel like I'm in the back seat right beside the straw hat full of dimes, man. It was just mind-blowing to me. It wasn't long after Charlie and Rosie were living with his mother in Los Angeles that Charles Manson would get arrested with a stolen car. It's okay to steal a car if you just drive around in your neighborhood with it, but when you take it across state lines, it becomes now a concern of the federal government, and it is a federal offense, and it's a whole different ball game that you're playing with now. You're playing with the federal government, and that's what Charlie was involved with. He was involved with a federal crime. Charlie's attorney would tell him that it would probably be a great idea if you would tell the judge that you have a pregnant wife and you really would love to get out and take care of your new child. But it would probably be a bad idea to have that wife come in and testify on your behalf of that very thing, because that wife was one of the people that came across all those borders with you in that stolen car. And all that other stolen stuff that they could put that on her, because this isn't, we're playing with the federal government now. So I don't know if that's a chance you want to take. And in the end, that wasn't a chance that Charlie wanted to take. He always did his own crimes and did his own time, and he never told on anybody. So he said, forget that. We'll just go with, I want to get out. We'd only be speculating if we said we knew what was going through Rosie's head, because that's the point then that she left Los Angeles and she never, ever, ever looked back. She never looked back, and she never said boo when the name Charlie Manson came up. I think she was trying to hide from that for the rest of her life. Like I said in the last video, they had just gotten married and they had just taken off. Now Manson was headed to jail, to prison, the federal prison. His mom was following him. She was going to go live by the federal prison. But Rosie was taken off. She was headed back to West Virginia. The next time that Charlie Manson would hear from Rosalie, it was through the mail, certified mail, to the federal prison saying she was filing for divorce. He could appeal it, but she was filing for divorce. What could he do? He appealed. I mean, you're in federal prison now. You know, you don't really love this girl. Why appeal it? Because he told me he knew what was going to come next. He knew that the state was going to end up taking his kid away from him. The next time that Charlie Manson heard from Rosalie, her name was Rosalie White. She was now married to a guy with the last name White. Now this certified mail was saying, Dear Charlie, Charles Manson Jr. is now going to be known as J. White, like the guy that I'm married to, and like me. What does that mean? In the state of California, it means you have lost your custody of that child. It's like an adoption almost. You don't have to adopt a kid to take a kid. Manson appealed again. Appeal denied. He's now Jay White. Manson cannot stand the system that we have in America that gives all the rights of a child to a woman. He could probably fight in court for, he could probably stand up and give a speech on why that's so bad that the woman gets all the rights and the man gets no rights when it comes to a child. If there was one thing that made him mad, it was that. Because he never want to give up his rights to his children. He wanted his children. But now, the state can just say, no, they're not your children anymore. They're the mom's children. Because the mom knows best. Ah, it just made him mad. Rosie and Charlie Jr. weren't living real far from where I grew up in Ohio. And I used to hear in high school that Charles Manson lives in Ohio, and I used to think, I thought Charles Manson was in prison. But, you know how high school kids are. Manson, he lives out in Cadiz. I'm like, wow, that's cool. So it was always a rumor that Charlie Manson lived in Ohio. It wasn't really a secret, even down in my tiny little town of Wellsville. So if Jay was trying to keep it a secret that he was Charlie Jr., he was probably blowing it when he was in high school. He was probably telling everybody, because we even knew down there. Rosie went on to have 2 more kids with this white guy. And it strikes me as really funny that, okay, our first child's name was Charles Manson Jr. Our second child's name, what would you name your second child if your first child's name was Charlie Manson Jr.? But now his name's actually Jay White, because you've changed his name to Jay White. You're trying to hide the Charlie Manson Jr. part, right? So you would want to stay as far away from that kind of stuff. I don't know if it was a diversion, but she named her second child Jesse James. Jesse James White. Can you believe it? So she's got Charles Manson Jr. Hi, this is my son, Charles Manson Jr. This is my other son, Jesse James. And here's my third son. He's a poor mountaineer, barely kept his family fed. This is Jed. Yeah, the third kid name was, sadly, every single one of Rosie's 3 kids, Charlie Manson Jr., Jesse James, and Jed, every single one of them met a tragic ending. Every one of them. Little Jesse James was playing with a gun. You can read about that at Find a Death. Look up Jesse James White. Playing with a neighbor with a gun, and it went off. Jed, he got caught up in drugs, and you know what happens when that happens. And we all know the story about Charlie Jr. He just pulled over on the side of an off-ramp and said it's over with. Jay had gotten married by that point too. He was married and he had a child. And Charlie actually had a grandchild by blood, because Jay was now Jay White, so he was somebody else's kid. But Charlie did have a grandkid. I mean, a blood grandkid that he would never see, that has nothing, he wants nothing to do with Charles Manson at all, period. Because right now he could be involved in this court case as well, because he's actually Charlie Manson's grandson for real. His name's Paul. And the year that Charlie Manson Jr. died, there was also another grandson that was born. I don't know if that contributed to the fact of why Charlie Manson did what he did, but there was another grandson that was born too. He was divorced at that point, and I don't believe that kid was his. But Rosie still, she still acknowledged that grandson as well, even though it might not have been Charlie Manson Jr.'s. And his name was Daniel. By 1988, Charles Manson had a book out with Neil Edmonds where he talked about Rosalie and his son, and it kind of outed Jay, I guess, a little bit in that year, 1988, because that was the first year that probably anybody had heard about Jay since then was in the book. And now, actually, the Manson family was actually looking for Jay, trying to find Jay for Charlie. Because Charlie actually wanted to see his son. He didn't care what the state said. He still wanted to see his son. On May 15th, 1992, Jay White had a Freedom of Information Act done on himself under the name of Charles Milles Manson Jr. And that was the address he was living at with his mother in Las Vegas, Nevada. This is the letter that he would use in conjunction with his driver's license that said Jay White on him with the same address to prove to the Manson family that he was Charlie's son. Because he met with them. He met with the Manson family. Did you know the Manson family, some of them lived at Barker Ranch well after Manson was in prison? And Jay met with them up there. He was actually supposed to go with them and meet his dad. He took off. He didn't do it. I don't know if he chickened out. I don't know if the Manson family themselves scared him to death. But he didn't go. But he did leave this behind. Charlie never seen his kid. Although he tried. Tried really hard. But in the end, it was 1 year later, and then the next news that Charlie got. The kid's gone. So, Charlie tried really hard to get Jay in there to see him. So he would probably do that for any relation he had, I would think. But none of them ever tried. Rosie eventually died, and in her obituary, it mentions Jay in there, and it also mentions Jay and her grandson Paul, and it also mentions her grandson Daniel in her obituary. Even though it's kind of touchy if Daniel was ever even. I think maybe the old lady was screwing around on Jay, and Daniel came, and I don't know. Especially if Daniel's watching. I don't even know if Daniel knows any of this stuff. But she even mentioned him in the obituary. The one that's left out is this guy, Jason. He never gets mentioned anywhere in the story. But, again, we're just waiting for some paperwork. Maybe it'll all add up. Who knows? Until next time, peace. And Jason Freeman, maybe you can quit calling yourself Jason Freeman Manson and start calling yourself Jason Freeman White. It's more appropriate, wouldn't you say? Again.